Hey, how's it going? This is just a wee intro to my walk and talk video that I did up the Hill of Beans a couple of days ago, where I go through the potential books for my top 10. You might already have seen my top 10 because I put that out yesterday, and yeah, there's going to be some crossover, obviously, but this includes more books. So it goes through basically all of my 5-star reads from 2025 and a few 4 stars as well. Plus it's up the Hill of Beans where the scenery is just spectacular. So yeah, if you want to see that, watch along. I think it's worth watching even if you've seen the top 10, because yeah, the Hill of Beans is amazing. So there you go. Without any further ado, here's me up the hill. Hey, how's it going? Back up the Hill of Beans, my favourite place in the world. It's the 30th of December, so we're getting close to the next year. I was going to do a top 10 or a top 12 of the year. I just watched the Plant-Based Bride's book bracket video, which I found fascinating. She's got a whole aesthetic going on with stationery and notebooks and a system. So I thought, well, I could do that. And then I thought, no, I couldn't. First of all, I can't draw. It would have taken me hours to come up with something that looked terrible. So it's not a good use of my time. So I thought I could do it as a screen grab and just talk through my Notion system, because that's where everything is. But I figured, no, do you know what? It's such a beautiful day. I'm going to handwrite my 5-star reads of the year and talk about them up here, because one of my goals, another goal, which I've already talked about up here when I did my goals video, which you can go and watch if you like, but I hadn't added this one, and that is to be more loose with my content, because one of the failures I had last year was that I had 5 periods of longer than 14 days of publishing on YouTube, and my goal was not to do that. And the reason is resistance, imposter syndrome, all the stuff that creators deal with. And one of the ways I deal with it, or I defeat it, or I take away its power, is to come up here, because this is when I feel at my most connected to whatever is out there. So this is a way of achieving that goal going into next year. Loosen up with content by recording when I'm exercising in nature, or when I'm actually driving. That was another thing that came up in my morning pages today. I spend a lot of time in my camper van driving to Masonic meetings around Argyll and beyond, and I do feel quite connected then as well. The resistance has gone, so that's another place I might record in the future. Right, that's the preamble. This is my wee traveller's notebook. There's a moleskin inside it, and attached is a Kaweco Sport brass ballpoint. I carry this in my pocket at all times, and on this I have written my books. Right, so I've put it into months, and how many books have I got in total? There's maybe 14 or 15, so I'd like to try and round that down to 10. I might struggle, we'll see. Right, so first up, January. Interestingly, I was just talking about resistance there with you. The first book on my list is The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. Now this is a reread, and it's a book that discusses resistance. Steven Pressfield is, I would say he's a favourite author, because I haven't read any of his fiction, but I've heard him on podcasts with the likes of Rick Rubin and I forget the name of the other guy, kind of doctor guy, where he's talking about connection to source, to the universe. Let me just check this is recording, hang on. Yeah, because I have done this before when it wasn't. So it's like, it's set out into aphorisms, if you like, where you can read a page a day or find your favourite pages and write the quotations down, because it's ridiculously helpful. And yeah, it's a 5-star read because I find it so helpful. It's a reread, so perhaps it's not in the top 10. We'll see when I get to the end. Yeah, definitely recommend it though. One of the areas where I disagree with him though is that he sees resistance as a thing to be defeated, whereas I see it as something that we ourselves give power to, and we ourselves can take that power away through this kind of thing. That's what I'm talking about with being looser with my content, coming up here and recording, or recording from behind the wheel of my van. At those times when I feel connected, there is no resistance, you know. And that's not always a good thing, because sometimes the stuff I make is rubbish. But yeah, I think that resistance isn't to be defeated, it's to be ignored, if you like. Right, next up is The Grey King by Susan Cooper. The Grey King is the 4th book in the Dark is Rising sequence, and this is a series of young adult fantasy books. When were they written? The 70s maybe, or the 80s? Must have been the 70s, because I read them in the 80s and they weren't new then. I did know this, and I've recorded a video about it which I can link to. I'll put up the wee thing you can click on. The 4th book is set in Wales, and it takes a bit of a turn from the others. It goes into mythology, ancient English mythology. And in this instance, it talks about the Welsh mountains, and there's some Welsh language in it. And we follow the main character from The Dark is Rising, Will. The Darkest Rising is the 2nd book, which gives its name to the whole series. And Will is an old one, who's a kind of mythical, what would you call him? A guardian, perhaps? He's one of, is it 12 or 6? I can't remember how many old ones there are, but Will is the last. And he goes to Wales to stay with some family to recuperate from an illness, and he ends up getting involved in a hunt for a Holy Grail type quest. A mythical instrument, I think it was. So I read it in January, so my memory's a little bit hazy. Oh my God, how good is it up here, by the way? Can you hear the silence? Depeche Mode comes to mind. Enjoy the silence. Bing. So yeah, that one stood out as my favourite in the series. I gave it 5 stars, and it includes some language actually. So if you're listening to the audiobooks, you'll notice that the narrator changes for this one, and I believe it's because Alex Jennings, who did the other 4, does not speak Welsh. That's my guess as to why they changed the narrator. I can't remember who the narrator is of The Grey King, but he does a fantastic job, and it has one of my favourite animals in fantasy, the dog. Yeah, I wouldn't say any more than that, but it's definitely a 5-star read. So I think of the 2, we'll get to that. February, Fool's Fate, Robin Hobb, which is a book of the Tawny-Man trilogy. Is it the 2nd one? It probably is, because she tends to write the best ones. She keeps the 2nd book as the best one in the trilogies. Royal Assassin. Ship of Magic's the 1st one. Ship of Destiny. I can't remember the order that they come in, same as with this one. But Fool's Fate I've got it down as 5 stars. I believe that's the one where there's a big revelation I was reading it as I was driving through Largs, and it was dark, February, yeah, so not much daylight. And I remember when the revelation moment came, I was punching the air, and I immediately sent a text memo, voice memo, to a friend of mine, Mayor, who I know had read the book before, and I was like, I need to talk about this, bloody hell. Robin Hobb, fantasy writer extraordinaire. I'm intending to finish the whole series, The Realm of the Elderlings, this year. Sorry, we're still in 2025. Next year. So yeah, fool's fate. Moving on to March, I've got Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I started that in January, so it took me a while to get through it. I want to read a Dickens book every year till I've read them all. So far I've read Great Expectations and Bleak House. I'm not through the whole oeuvre very far at all. But the fact that it's on this list tells you how much I enjoyed it. Helped along by Katie Lumsden's vlogs on her Booktube channel. I found that to be incredibly helpful. This year I'm going to read David Copperfield's. I've got The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. I had read, what's the Magic series with Ged or Jed? Wizard of Earthsea. I'd read that one and wasn't really that impressed by it. This was like, 20 years ago probably. The Disaffection, no. The Dispossessed, however, blew my mind. I read it with Jared Henderson, I think. He did a read-along of it on his Substack channel. And it's a sci-fi novel that kind of documents socialism versus capitalism in a sci-fi world. And we've got a main character who comes from the communist world, and he goes to the capitalist world as a scientist to share scientific findings and take part in a conference or something. And what he sees there blows his mind, and it's just so well written. It's inspired me to read more Ursula K. Le Guin. That's The Dispossessed. I've got Crime and Punishment as well. I don't really need to talk too much about that. You all know Crime and Punishment, right? Dostoevsky. I did it as a read-along on my channel. Started it last year and finished it this year. That was my first read-along, and it's kind of paved the way for me to do more of that kind of thing on my channel, to try and learn more about Russian literature, go deeper into it, share my knowledge and grow my channel, hopefully help others to read these fantastic works of literature and not to feel intimidated by them, to read them with a group. So there we go. April, I've got 3 down here. I've got Red Star Over Russia, which is a photograph book. It's put together by David King from photographic collections of pictures of Russia and the Soviet Union and propaganda posters, and it's an absolutely delightful book. I don't know whether could I include it as a non-fiction photograph essay book on my top? Of course I can do whatever I want. Possibly might be in the top 10. Next up is a reread, which is A Disaffection by James Kelman, a Scots author. This was the first of his books that I read back in 95, 96, when I was in Ukraine. I had a year abroad in Odessa, and I used to borrow a lot from the British Council Library. This was one that I borrowed then, having never heard of Kelman, and it blew my mind. It's written in the Scots dialect, which is fine for me, because that's my dialect, and it's like a slice of social realism. We follow the main character, is it Patrick, I think his name is? He's a school teacher and he's disaffected. He's kind of fed up with the way that he's treated as a teacher at school. He's fed up with his life situation, and he's in love with a fellow teacher who's married and doesn't love him. And it makes me think a wee bit of Jude the Obscure, which I've just finished, by Thomas Hardy. Interesting, that's the first time that's came to my head. He's kind of like a Jude character in a way, but set in, I think it must be like 80s or 90s Glasgow, and he's in a suburban high school as a teacher. Some of the banter he has with his pupils as well is choice. So that's probably going to make the list as a top 10. The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. That's the second book in the Dark Tower series, which I've read the entire series. I'd forgotten how good this one was. It goes beyond the gunslinger into the choosing of the main characters in the book and in the series, and I just love the way it's written. It's thrilling, gripping, joyful. We straddle the worlds between Midworld and our world. At one point, the gunslinger himself, Roland, finds himself in New York, which is hilarious. There's a big scene goes down in a pharmacy because he needs some Aston, as he calls it, which is aspirin. I loved that book, and so I've got the next one on my list for 2026. I'm excited for that as well. Such fun. Right, June. No, hang on. Where's May? I moved May because there were no 5-star reads. So these are both 4 stars, so I won't go into them too much. Gilgamesh by Emily H. Wilson, which is the second book in her trilogy based on the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a kind of fantasy series. And yeah, it's fantastic. I've got Ninshubar, the third book, on my list for 2026. Why not 5 stars? It might move up if I read it again. I just felt 4 was where it was. And the other one is Overreach by Owen Matthews, which is a non-fiction book about the history of Putin and Zelensky. Fascinating, well written. I did know quite a lot about Putin beforehand, but I knew basically nothing about Zelensky. So I think this was recommended. Was it? No, I heard Owen Matthews on a podcast. That's what it was. I think it was the Telegraph podcast, Planet Normal. And I was inspired from having listened to his expertise on the subject to go and read his book, Overreach. So he'll be showing up again quite shortly. In fact, he's going to show up again now as we get into June. Stalin's Children, which it turns out I had on my shelf because I have my Notion database, which has the author of every book as in its own database. And when I clicked on the author of Overreach, I saw that I already had Stalin's Children on my shelf. I was like, oh, I'd forgotten I'd bought that. So I read that, and that was a biography basically of, or an autobiography about the author's time in Russia, and also about his grandfather and his father. It's right in my wheelhouse, that kind of thing. It was like a kind of, what's that show that's on TV where people look back through their family trees? You know, it's like following a puzzle. It was kind of like that, as we followed Matthews into some of the archives of Soviet documents so that he could find out what had happened to his grandfather, who was purged basically by Stalin in the 1930s as a scientist, or an engineer. I think he was an engineer. So he was killed in the purges. I've just remembered I'd left my walking stick somewhere and was going to pick it up on the way back, and I've forgotten. I better go and get it. So yeah, that was a fantastic book, right in my wheelhouse. So there's a non-fiction in my choice for my top 10. Next in June I've got Oblomov, I don't need to say too much about that because again it was a read along on my channel. It's one of my favourite Russian classic novels from the 19th century, and I think it's overlooked, not underlooked, as I said in my last video, is overlooked. Where Crime and Punishment, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, they seem to get all the views. Oblomov doesn't, and it should, so I'm here to cheer for it. So there we go. Okay, for July I've got The Handmaid's Tale. This is one which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. TV show was very popular and we watched it, which is what inspired me to read the book. Here we are, one walking stick. So yeah, it was a fantastic book, and I actually read it twice because I read it once in audio and I was busy doing painting and stuff out in the garden and it didn't sink in too well, and so I read it again with a physical copy and it moved up then from 4 to 5. I've also read the Testaments this year. It's not on my list here, but I did enjoy the Testaments as well. It doesn't get anywhere near as much love as Handmaid, for obvious reasons. The Handmaid's Tale is just a fantastic work of dystopian sci-fi. Is it sci-fi? Dystopian literature. I loved it, loved it. August, I've got The Brothers Karamazov, which I vlogged and wrote reviews about and loved, which is interesting because when I first read it as a student, I had no love for it at all. It's funny how we change over time. So was that a 30-year gap? And it went from hate to love. I'll definitely read it again. Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, so that's him on the list potentially twice. Well, he's on the list twice. Whether he gets picked or not, we'll see. September, The Gulag Archipelago. I read the abridged version of this, translated by Harry Willits and Thomas P. Whitney, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of course, and it's one of those books that had been on my list for 30 years. Finally got to it. It was even better than I expected. In fact, it was easier to read than I expected. That's something that I should say about it, because I always felt intimidated by it, not just because of the harrowing subject matter, but because I was expecting it to be dense and difficult, but it wasn't. It was eminently readable, which surprised me, even though the subject matter was, of course, harrowing. There's the moon. See if you can see that in the background there. So that was September. October, I've got The White Guard, which was a 4-star read by Mikhail Bulgakov. This was another 30-year book on my list, which I finally got to, and not only did I get to, I read it twice because I was doing a read-along on my channel, and it's kind of on the list because I enjoyed the read-along so much and I learnt so much and I enjoyed it, especially having people actually following along made it all the more special, but still a 4-star book. November, this is a 5-star book, London Fields by Martin Amis. This was a reread going back to the same year that I first read Disaffection by James Kelman. So I kind of put those books together in my mind because I read them around the same time the first time, and so I read them again around the same time the second time, and loved it. It's a problematic book, I'm just going to put that out front, because the characters are misogynistic, I suppose is the word. But having said that, I think it's very much a portrait of its time, of its place, which is London in the late 90s. And it was written, what, 95 I think it came out, so it was set in the future a little bit. It's just, Nicola Six is the murderee. She's introduced right at the beginning, and she knows she's going to be murdered. There's a buzzard. Wow, peace and quiet, by the way. I'm kind of spoiling the peace and quiet while I was talking, am I not? But yeah, she knows she's going to be murdered and she doesn't know by whom. And then we followed the characters of Keith, who's a darts player, and the other guy. I read it in November, I've forgotten his name already. The other guy. His name's Guy. Come on, Kamser. So, yeah, it's a fantastic book. When I first read it, I finished it on Arran, actually, when I was on holiday, and I remember feeling connected to the universe upon finishing it. Just the prose, the writing style, and the plot and the characters as well, but I think it was the prose and style that elevated it in my mind. So for me to be reading it again 30 years later and still be mesmerised by it, by the style, where of course now I'm seeing some of the problems of the characters which I wouldn't have seen back then in my 20s, early 20s, mid 20s. December, we've got two. We've got Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty, which is a grimdark fantasy based on the Mahabharata of Indian folklore and mythology. Fantastic debut novel by Mohanty. It blew my mind, actually. It was so good. I listened to a lot of it in the car, on the van, as I was driving about Argyll from Masonic meetings in the dark. And so a lot of it didn't really sink in properly, so I ended up re-listening to it, would you believe, with the book in my lap. Once I'd got to the end and the characters were kind of consolidated in my mind, I went back to the beginning because there was a lot I'd missed. But it was worth it, totally worth it. It's one of those books that I'll definitely read again, and I'm going to read the sequel for sure in 2026. That was my book of the year until I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which also blew my mind. Goodness me. I'd read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I've read it twice. I read it last year with Ross Hardy and Laura from Hardy's Books. Also of Station Books in Tunbridge Wells now, little bookshop, independent bookshop. So I know I enjoy Susanna Clarke's writing and the worlds that she creates, and in Piranesi she's done it again with one of the weirdest worlds I've ever come across. It had very strong Gormenghast vibes, which is a good thing in my mind because I love the Gormenghast trilogy. Yes, even the third one. So to have a short book like that at the end of the year with magical world hopping, yeah, I loved it. And the way that she dealt with sort of memory loss in this fantasy world, and the way that the reveals were made, yeah. It's one of those books though where once you've had the reveals, a reread will be different. So I'm curious, I mean I will reread it, I'm sure. I'm curious about what a reread will feel like now that I've finished it and know. If you know, you know, kind of thing. So yeah, that's me. Got to the end of my list. I don't know how I would break it down into a top 10, to be honest. How many have I got? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Can we go with a top 20 and just call it a day? I think that's probably wise. I might come back and do a top 10 just for the YouTube algorithm. I'll rewatch my own video perhaps and then figure out, but I'll end up just saying the same thing again, won't I? Is that what Elizabeth did in her book bracket? Yeah, I think one video is probably enough. So if you've got to the end of this, thanks for watching. I appreciate you. This will most likely be my last video of the year. I might do one on my TBR for 2026, because I've started making a list already. Some of them I've already mentioned here, so yeah, look out for that perhaps at some point. And yeah, I mean, have a great new year. It's been best reading year of my life, and I'm hoping I can say the same at this time next year. Wouldn't that be awesome? And there's no reason why it shouldn't be, because it just gets better and better, particularly as I grow in my Substack channel and do more read-alongs and learn more and do more guidance and get better as a writer and a content creator. Yeah, books are awesome, aren't they? Thanks for watching. See you later.